kids, today we're going to learn about Native Americans. But before we get started with our story, let's go over some words you need to know. First word is borrow. When we borrow something, it means to take or use something for a while and then return it. Example, Anne wants to borrow a box of crayons from Jaden. The second word is coast. The coast is the land that comes next to a sea or an ocean. For example, as their boat got to the land, they could see many trees along the coast. So it's the edge where the water comes to the land on an ocean or a sea. Third is deserts. Deserts are large, dry areas of land, and it has very little rain. An example, there are some very hot and sandy deserts in California and Nevada. The fourth word is roamed. Roamed means to wander, or walk around. Example, the herd roamed from the countryside looking for food. Then the fifth word is tribes. Tribes are groups of people who are similar and who share the same language or common ancestors, customs, and laws. Customs are things that they are used to doing. Example, there are many tribes of Native Americans living across the country. Now, let's get on with our story. You're going to be learning about these Native Americans for the next several days. And Native Americans were the first known people to live on these continents that we live on now. So here we go. Let's learn about them. Long, long ago, long before you and I can remember, long before your grandparents and their grandparents and their grandparents can even remember, there were no living people on the land where we live today. Now there were woods and plains, but no people. There were rivers and lakes, but no people. There were deserts and mountains, but no people. There were plenty of birds and fish and animals and insects, but there were no people. But there were thousands of years ago, much earlier than any of us can remember. The first known people who lived in America were called Native Americans or American Indians, and they lived in all parts of the continent. That means all over the United States and Canada and Mexico. And some lived in the desert. Others lived in the mountains. Some lived in the woods. And others lived on the coast, near the ocean. Now remember, the coast is the land next to the ocean. People of the desert live very differently from the people on the coast. Can you guess why that would be? Think about it for a minute. You're going to learn about some of those different ways Americans first known people or Native Americans lived. So we'll have to listen carefully so that we can tell the difference from the different people. The Native Americans of long ago all needed the same things we need today, all living things. They needed food and water to stay alive, and they needed shelter or places to go to protect themselves from the weather and the wild animals, and they needed clothing to keep themselves warm and dry. But the food the desert people ate was not like the food that the coastal people ate. And houses that protected people in the woods did not look the same as houses who protected those who lived in the desert. Here are some teepees. Now, when we look at this picture, some lived in teepees, and teepee is spelled a couple of ways. So it can be spelled T-E-P-E-E or T-I-P-I-S. Both ways are correct. Now, let's look at where some people lived in house called a wetu. Wetus were houses made out of bark and sticks. Then some lived in hogans. These were made out of mud and clay and big timbers. Some lived in sand. And these were called pueblos, where they built up the sand and clay together and formed houses. Others lived in a longhouse. This too was made out of bark and sticks, except for they were long, and that's why they call them longhouses. Native Americans of long ago had to rely on their knowledge of nature, of the earth, and the plants and the animals that surrounded them, and everywhere they roamed or wandered. Now, did you notice that each one of these houses was in a different environment? I hope you did, because that's how we're going to look at it. We're going to watch, we're going to learn about different places that these Native Americans lived and how they lived in those different places. So these Native Americans found ways to borrow or use from the earth all that they needed to live on. So here we go. Some Native Americans grew their own vegetables and fruit, and others hunted buffalo. Some Native Americans hunted in the woodlands, or where the forests were, and others caught fish from the rivers and lakes and oceans. Some Native Americans cooked their food over a fire and an open fire, and others baked their food in special ovens and made out of clay. The Native Americans also needed water, but there were no sinks or running water inside their homes. So where do you think the Native Americans found water long ago? If you said in the rivers and lakes, you were correct. Native Americans collected rainwater also, and they got their water from the lakes and rivers and streams. Native Americans of long ago did not have cars and trucks. There were no buses or trains or planes. So, do you know how they got around? You're going to think about that. Let's look and see. So long ago, Native Americans traveled by foot. In other words, they walked around. There were no paved roads. Native American paths were made by pounding of their own footsteps and the hooves of their animal herds. After Native Americans were here for many years, they started riding horses. After that, some traveled on horseback, and others traveled in canoes. What do you see in this picture? No matter where they lived, Native Americans made all their own clothes. Some Native American women and girls wore skirts and dresses, and men and boys often wore what was called breechcloths and leggings. A breechcloth is kind of like short pants. They used materials from their surroundings to make their clothes. Native American clothing was often made from animal skins. Can you see the animal skins in this picture? They would use elk, deer, buffalo, and rabbit, and they often decorated their clothes with beads, porcupine quills, and fringe. Their beads would be made out of wood or shells or rocks. During the cold winter months, they wore coats of animal fur to stay warm. Others wore clothes made from soft inner bark of a cedar tree. Wearing clothes from a plant. I think we learned about that before. Sometimes they decorated them with seashells. Others wore clothing made from fibers of different plants, the cotton and the yucca plant, and trimmed them with animal bones. In the winter, they covered themselves with cloaks to stay warm. Many of the men and boys and girls in each Native American tribe across the land from ocean to plains to the woods or wherever they were, wore moccasins on their feet. Now, moccasins are made out of animal skins as well, and they would sometimes decorate them. Some Native Americans, however, preferred to go in their bare feet. And so you see, the people who first came to live on the rich and varied lands that we now live in and call the United States of America were just rich and as varied as the land itself. They were alike in some ways and different in other ways, just as the people of America are today. So, let's do some comprehension and show what you know. In the read aloud, you heard, and everywhere they roamed, these Native Americans found ways to burrow or use from the earth and all they needed. Say the word roamed with me. Roamed. To roam means to wander. Some Native American tribes roamed around to look for food. How did the Native Americans roam around? How did they move from place to place? Think about it and answer. If I am walking to the library, I'm roaming. No, because you're going to a specific place. When we roam, we're just wandering. It doesn't mean we have a specific place. And when we were walking, we were using a part of our body to help us move. We could have also rode a horse or maybe a bicycle. The Native Americans usually used an animal or they walked. If I'm roaming in the woods, what does that mean? It means you are walking or hiking around, but not going to a specific place. If I'm walking in the woods, what does that mean? Am I roaming? No, because I know exactly where I'm going to go. I'm not just wandering. I'm going on a certain path. Have you ever roamed anywhere? Try to use the word roam and tell somebody about it. If necessary, talk to a partner, an adult, or ask someone else if they have ever roamed. Let's do some choices. I'm going to ask you some questions, and if what I say is an example of roaming, you're going to stand up. If I say what is not an example of roaming, you're going to sit down. Here we go. Kelsey walked quickly to class. I hope you're sitting down because she knew she was going to a specific place. The buffalo wandered around the plains. Stand up. Yes, they don't have a specific place necessarily. They just kind of go eat here, eat there, wherever their face takes them. Jack jumped over the candlestick. So you better be sitting down because he was jumping over a specific place. He was not wandering. Isabella ran to give her mother a hug. Or sitting down because she's running to a specific place. Johnny Appleseed traveled all around the country planting apple trees. Yep, you guessed it. You're standing up because he wandered and roamed all over. He didn't have any specific place he was going to. Thomas walked slowly around the playground thinking about the story he had just heard. You should be standing up because he's just wandering. He's not going any place special like the swings or the slide. Okay, kiddos, that concludes what our first introductory story is. So, see what you can find out about Native Americans. Talk to an adult and have them help you look for interesting facts about the Native Americans. Thanks for listening.